Right, well, welcome to the last session of the day, and in fact, last session of this conference. Thank you very much for coming on time. I'm delighted to introduce our speakers in 1 second. We've touched, of course, in the course of the last 2 days, including this afternoon, of course, on the topics that are the title of this session, Populism and Nationalism, but we'll be focusing in on them more specifically now. It's a hybrid meeting, so one of our speakers is online, as you can see, and he will be the first speaker. And after they've all spoken, I will open it up to a Q&A. So let me just introduce the speakers, one after the other. Professor Sergiu Mișcoiu, who is Faculty of European Studies at Babeș-Bolyai University here in Cluj. Dr. Fernando Herrero, who is from the University of Manchester, and Professor Slobodan, Markovich, regular visitor to the Ratziu Foundation School of Political Science at the University of Belgrade. So may I invite Professor Mișcoiu to start our deliberations.
Thank you very much. Please allow me to share my screen because for the moment it is not possible to do so. Meanwhile, I would like to thank the organizers. I have to say that I can't see you in the room now. I have only a screen with Ratziu Forum on the other part of the laptop. But I'm sure you are many and very interested. I'm very glad to be with you. And I hope that my presentation will arouse some interest. I'm still waiting for the ability to share the screen. And when I will have the occasion, I will get started immediately. Can you see it?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. So the presentation I will have today is about the relation between the newborn far-right party OUL and the support it got from some elements of the Orthodox Church in Romania. And without losing any more time, I will start by saying that, of course, the ties between churches and political parties are covered by extensive literature, but there is less about the reasons why the church would support specific newly created political parties. So I will try to explain why some members, and even many members of the Romanian Orthodox Church, made campaign in favor of OUL in the 2020 legislative elections. This will be based on the exploration of 18 of the results of 18 semi-structured interviews conducted with Orthodox priests, and the findings will illustrate three main reasons for the support of the party. The fact that these priests felt cornered by the existing anti-clerical attitudes in Romanian society. Then there was a huge amount of disappointment created by the mainstream parties for abandoning the church. And finally, that the church perceived the European Union as a threat to traditional Romanian values and way of life, at least those priests that we interviewed. To start with the general context, we have to say that since the 19th century, the creation of the modern national Romanian state, the Orthodox Church, abbreviated here, BOR, has tried to play an important role, defining itself as a part of the nation-building process. There were some major tensions, like the 1863 tension related to the law of secularization of monastic estates, but nevertheless, in spite of the trends towards modernization, the 1923 constitution granted BOR the status of dominant church and introduced a mechanism where the archbishops and the bishops became statutory members of the Senate. Moreover, we had the first Orthodox patriarch who served as a regent and as a prime minister later on in the interwar period. But this did not prevent the radicalization within the church of some nationalist Orthodox groups which contribute to the creation of the interwar far-right pro-Nazi Iron God. Under communism, BOR accommodated itself with the new political regime and obtained a rather privileged position. It took advantage, for instance, among others, of the dissolution of the Greek Catholic Church to use its important patrimony, and in a more or less implicit, but sometimes even in a very open way, the Orthodox Church supported the regimes in various forms, and this is of course, in spite of the large number of anti-religious actions, including the demolition of some churches perpetrated by the country's leaders and especially by Ceausescu. After 1989, BOR tried to justify its collaboration with the communist authorities, presenting it as a survival strategy. It played a traditionalist and nationalist card. It tried to canonize further on heroes, amplifying its role in state building. And in this way, it gained more autonomy in relation with the state, remaining, though, financially depending on state resources as the priests were paid by the state as state functionaries. This, of course, created an important vulnerability to political pressure. Nevertheless, as the trust in the church was more than 60% as compared to the trust in political parties, which was less than 15%, there was some sort of a spiral of seduction between the church and the main political parties. Parties started to include prominent priests, pastors, monks on the electoral list, becoming influential members of the parliament, especially in the 1990s. Ties were created, especially between the Social Democratic Party and other smaller nationalist parties with BOR, while the National Peasant Party in the 90s was closer to the Greek Catholic Church. The National Liberal Party, especially since the 2000s, has become close to the neo-Protestant networks, and the Hungarian Party, of course, closer to the Calvinist, Roman Catholic, and Unitarian churches. This translated itself in a series of initiatives favorable to the church, for instance, imposing religion as an optional discipline, but a quasi-obligatory discipline in school. Nevertheless, other claims of the church to reinstate the de jure senatorship for the important members of the Orthodox Church, or to repenalize abortion, or to maintain some penalties for homosexuality, were nevertheless rejected by the mainstream political framework. And especially on this last issue, homosexuality, lots of reactions were present within the ensemble of the churches and other religious groups, especially the Coalition for the Family, who tried to, as we know, change the constitution and to ban in this way any attempt to legalize same-sex marriage in 2018 in a referendum that failed because of the lack of sufficient participation. This created a huge amount of frustration among the proponents of this referendum, and this was canalized, at least partially, in the new party, the Alliance for the Unity of Romanians, born in September 2019, a nationalist radical right party, with elements of anti-equality and anti-multiculturalism on one hand, combined with Euroscepticism and very strong conservative values. Its pillars, as they are described by the party, are family, the country, faith, and freedom. And there are at least from the outset two reasons for what AUL was more appealing to the Orthodox Church than other previous parties. First, because AUL explicitly promotes the religious cause, and this creates a framework of convergence of values with the Church. And secondly, that because AUL was in the early stages of its development, and so the Church believed that it could influence more its discourse, its political agenda, by orienting the newly created party. In 2020, the Church support was coordinated, and the party was voted for in areas where priests were highly active. This was very visible within the diaspora, where AUL made 25%, but attendance was very low. And our research here concentrates on the 18 semi-structured interviews with Orthodox priests taken in January and February 2021. The respondents were selected on the criterion related to variation in terms of age, distribution, geographical distribution, covering all the 8 historical regions, and the differentiation between the rural and the urban communities. So inclusiveness, but of course representativeness was not possible in a qualitative research. And of course we try to deduce the main topics out of the interviews that were taken with the priests in such a way to understand why AUL was supported by an important amount of priests. The first conclusion is that we've got 2 groups of attitudes within the Church. The traditional attitude, and 2/3 of the respondents were there, with the traditional priests who have a strict national Orthodox view on Romanian collective identity, who are very critical about the loss of traditional values and the decay of local social cohesion, who believe that the Church must support political forces which are favorable to it, and who, most importantly here, were actively involved in the electoral campaign and supported AUL. All of these 12 priests voted for AUL and campaigned for AUL. Then we have a second group, we may call it the more progressive priests, 1/3 of them, who are more critical about Bor, especially about the leadership of Bor, less preoccupied by the delusion of traditional values. They opt for a more neutral position of the Church in politics. They draw a really thick line between religion and politics, and they do not discuss politics in their congregations. And what is even more relevant, none of this campaigned for one party in the 2020 elections, and none of them voted for AUL within these elections. And now to the and let's see these 3 main reasons I was talking about that went out of the interviews. The first reason for supporting AUL is related to the recent tensions about the place and the role of the Orthodox Church within the Romanian society, which created anxiety and frustration among the traditional priests. The enemies that they denounced during the interviews are the civil societies, I quote, groups who defend gay marriage and other such practices against nature, making, I quote, Marxist propaganda against our saints and martyrs. There was a profound disappointment about the mainstream political parties, and AUL, on the other hand, took solid moral stance against, I quote, homosexual deviations, it looked as being patriotic, defending the church and traditional values. Our candidates proved to be close to our stances in a genuine way, end of the quote. And of course, the men of the church have a natural duty to support this national force, as one priest in the south of Romania told us. The second reason is that we had the COVID-19 lockdown restrictions that created a counter-reaction of radicalization among many Orthodox priests, and this pushed them to make pro-our campaign. Our openly and publicly opposed the restrictions, which were, according to some priests, excessive, abusive, or, I quote, another attempt to ruin the faith of the Romanians. Our defense of the church's behavior during the restrictions was a very strong argument to endorse the new party. I quote again, the only party which is young, vigorous, and with people who, even if they didn't go all to the best universities, are patriotic and faithful. So the second reason is presented here. And finally, the third reason related to more general Romanian traditional values and way of life that are under threat. The paradox is that most of these priests, the great majority of them, support Romania's EU membership, especially because it brings economic prosperity. But they have major concerns about the negative influence of Westernization and Europeanization. And the most sensitive issue is, once again, the contagion of practices such as same-sex marriage. I quote, all over Western Europe, people have given up their faith, and everywhere you go, you see sodomy, drug use, churches are empty and have remained so for years. These misfortunes will come to us too, said one priest in the north. Our was seen as a rampart against the loss of Romanian national identity due to this forced Europeanization. And moreover, they felt a need to counter-attack by backing our, who, I quote, will not hesitate to say no to the European Union when our values, family, faith, language are threatened, end of the quote. And very quickly, because my time is off, the conclusions of this research. Of course, the contextual reason of this mobilization was related to the anti-pandemic restrictions imposed by the national authorities. Nevertheless, the support by numerous priests has to be connected not necessarily to a wider setting of agenda based on religious issues, but rather as a reaction in this very tense context. Nevertheless, there was an expectation to be defended by the party against anti-clerical attitudes or against liberal European values. There were rewards expected once the party was elected to parliament. And so, in this case, we can see that Church's approach was closer to the one of an interest group. There was a high capacity that's clear of adaptation of both. There was an identification of a political partner to help in addressing the emerging challenges, and this proved to be a win-win combination. Why? Because both focused electoral support on a single party, on our, and opposed to the prior isolated efforts in the past, they succeeded in pushing our to 9% in elections. And on the other hand, our gained parliamentary representation, and in this way continued in showing support even after the elections. Even very recently, we had lots of manifestation of this support for the cause of the church, pushing it even more on this reactionary nationalist orthodoxist past. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Mișcoiu. We will come back to you after the other two speakers have spoken. So if you could stay online with us, please, for the moment. You'll disappear from the screen, and our two other presenters have PowerPoint presentations.
So, can you hear me okay? It's not too close. I found myself flagging in the afternoon, but anyway, let's see if we can get something going. So I'm going to be talking about populism, some thoughts on populism. And I'm bringing you this gentleman, the scheme of things. How is the term populism used generally in the mass media as a form of anti-establishment? And there would be right or left modalities. How to understand the term vis-a-vis authors such as Ortega y Gasset, J.W. Mueller, apologies for the diacritics, someday I'll find the diacritic sign in my new computer, Levitsky and Ziblatt, and Ernesto Laclau. I'm bringing you a sandwich, quote, Hispanic bread and a little bit of a thin ham inside. Connections to nationalism. I'm simply going to conclude that perhaps one way of looking at populism is an exacerbation of nationalism, and the ground and telos of the nation state is clearly one of them, but I'm wondering out loud if that's the only one that we can think of. The geography I'll be making at the end, I plea for expansion inside the conventions of the West and the rest. And the possible evaluation, perhaps populism is a symptom of tumultuous times. Perhaps I like the notion of interregnum. We are in between, perhaps eras, perhaps in between. There's a nice definition of interregnum as absent sovereign, or at least a hesitant sovereign. And I'll make some comments about the big picture or geopolitics. All right, so let's see. I'm moving now. Not going to the next slide. For some reason, I'm doing the same thing that I was doing before. I'm stuck. Let me just take a sip of water. There you go. So which one did you do? This one. All right, there we go. All right. So, is the next one? I'm bringing you some pictures so that you don't have to look at me.
It's a spoiler alert.
It's a spoiler. There you have the gentleman in question. Some alive, some dead. So which one should, if I want to advance? This one, the left? No. Oh, there we go. Okay, so, all right, where to begin the story? Well, okay, Ortega y Gasset's Revolt of the Masses, published in news in the paper The Sun, El Sol, which no longer exists, in op-ed pieces, 1929, and in book form, 1930. Now, this became a popular book, struck a chord, it was a bestseller in Germany. For Ortega, it was Germany. Okay, that's the world that mattered to him. Europe is ground and horizon, source of inspiration and preoccupation for Ortega, who is considered a Europeanist author in his lifetime and also today. Our public intellectual engages with culture in all its forms, high, middlebrow, and popular. He's looking for interlocutors in academia, newspapers, media, etc. Revolt of the Masses is a hybrid, mixed genre, journalistic op-ed, a collection of journalistic op-ed pieces. The first section is about the new phenomenon of mass society or mass man, nascent, unrefined, or uncultured, rebellious social forces. The term populism is not yet used, yet mass is what Ortega is looking at. It's a revolt, not a revolution. The Russian Revolution is already happening, and it's already happened, but this is a revolt, what Ortega is looking at. And we are entering the early connotations and promises of modern consumer society. There's also artistic dehumanization. The terminology of Ortega is a very famous expression when he's looking at experimental high modernism. Here we go again. It doesn't like me. The left? The one in the middle? No.
The mouse bit down.
I'm doing the mouse, I promise. So So hold on. Why does he like you and doesn't like me?
Gender bias.
He's gender bias. You're pressing this button. So what? Oh, there we go. No, like if I go back, go back there. Completely useless. I wasn't there. Useless in the first conference. I don't know what's going on. All right. So the second section is about geopolitics. Under the title, Who Governs or Who Rules the World? It deals with the tense 1920s, 1930s. The conventional template of the ideological struggle is among liberalism, fascism, and communism, giving way to the Americanization of Europe and the West after World War II, later, and obviously taking place later after World War II and the Cold War. Ortega sees that Europe is caught in between the United States of America and the Soviet Union. Mutatis mutandis, Europe is now still in between the US and Russia, inside Eurasia, or the age of Putin, as this gathering calls it. And China represents a colossal challenge. The state we're in, Ortega remains worth reading today. Do we try? There you go. So, second exhibit, Mr. Müller, What is Populism? Our Princetonian professor of German instruction, an example of the insufficient conventionality of political reason circulating widely in the Anglo-zone. The Penguin book, easy, general consumption, the level of palatable generality that speaks of anti-establishment insurgency from the liberal Anglo-language position of establishment normality. Do I try? Oh, there we go. There's a lot of text in here. Let me see. Hold on a second. Apologize for this. So, obviously, I'm not going to read all this. What I'm going to say is populism for him is shadow, is peril, is danger, is fundamentally American-European phenomenon, and the South American dimension is tangential. So it's the noise of the petty bourgeoisie or the peasants, blue collar, uncouth no manners of those who storm sites of power and privilege. It's an inferior position and reactive resentment. There is disruption, there is bad temper, and noises nearby and far away along the journey. Miller attributes moral argument to the populists, and this moralism is, in his view, anti-pluralist. The particularity arrogates for itself exclusivity of the social totality, and this is bad for him. Apologies, because I had a lot of text and I cut it in a previous. I have two PowerPoints. One is the version I put together and the short version. So I think I have in front of me the long version. I'll try to cut it down as I go along. Müller presents a triple critique of populism. One, the populi are exclusionary and they have a boundary problem. Two, the populists are not pluralists or multiculturalists, as though they per se always wanted to be a homogeneous society. And three, they are not empirical, i.e. they do not adhere to verifiable data and hence adhere to a moral symbolic identification with values. The category of the people is used, but is never anyone's permanent possession. The fully, the final, the terminal are totem and taboo domains for Müller. The people cannot be thoroughly instrumentalized, abrogated, or totalized by any speaking parts. Pars, not pro toto, this is his language. Liberal Democrats like Müller, of Müller disposition, are accordingly relativists and particularists from the official privileged position of the polis as constitutors. Let me skip the following. He makes a reference to Fukuyama. He doesn't really look at Russia. He doesn't look at not so much at Eastern Europe, and he doesn't look at all about China. What is populism? The book is no great powder to the petard. Conclusion offers 7 theses on populism. Its permanent shadow of representative politics. It is anti-elitist or anti-pluralist in the sense that exclusivity to the people populists are or want to be for Müller constitute a moral or homogeneous entity. Populists seek, foster, promote symbolic representation in new to empirical refutation. They are called positive identitarians with a lot of dark passions. 4 is not a path to more, according to him, is not a path to more participation in politics. They make exclusivity claims to government, state, and then Müller continues, therefore, configure mass clientelism, corruption, and the suppression of anything like a critical civil society. 6 is a danger to democracy and not just to liberalism. He quotes Zakaria, so Leon will be happy about that. But he's saying it's not fundamental, populism is not a fundamental threat to liberal democracy, but to democracy in total. And 7 is not a sustained corrective to liberal democracy, yet brings some underrepresented sectors closer to the American fold. Third exhibit, Levinsky and Ziblatt, How Democracies Die, What History Reveals About the Future. Well, the title is misleading because it should really be what is happening to the GOP, the Republican Party, as made evident by the Trump presidency. It's a slim, and the book is published 1 year after the Trump presidency. And we can say that we're still in these troubled waters. The generality of democracy's history and future is superficially false. Despite the relative opening of vistas and some mention of Latin American environments, biographically, Levinsky is married to a Peruvian woman. What matters is again the internal trouble within the US political system. The finger points out in the direction of the Republican Party, hollowed out from within. Obviously, it merits thorough exploration. So, from chapter 7 onwards, we're dealing with the tragedy, with the legacy of the 80s in the US, the increasing polarization of American politics, the culmination in Trump authoritarianism, and this is the author's terminology. The unwritten rules of civility and cooperation are blown off, and intense animus and non-cooperative behavior between the parties is now the norm. Toleration, restraint, and bipartisanship are gone. Perhaps once upon a time there were usages, that's the language they use, perhaps there were usages, folkways, and conventions holding, with or without caveats, but not any longer. And obviously, what Levinsky and Ziblatt are doing is there's a level, interestingly with the talk, I think it was yesterday, there's a certain level of exceptionality that is now taking hold of the American polity, but obviously they're never going to go in the direction of a more radical Giorgio Agamben critique of American democracy. Here you have them, the institutionalists on the US Democrat side of the line, hence the defense of theoretical gatekeeping and of check and balances. With no reference to international affairs, domestic troubles in separate democracies take the main light. We travel to many different national situations, too many. Allende, Chavez, Correa, Spanish Republic leading to the Civil War, and we go back and forth to the 20s, the 30s, the Obama years, Benito Mussolini, we add Fujimori, Peru, Getulio Vargas in Brazil, Erdogan and Orbán. Suspension of the rules of the game, that's what populism entails. Denial of legitimacy of opponents, thinness of toleration or encouragement of violence, the curtailing of civil liberties, including media outlets, mockery and insults. Not quite doing a good discourse analysis, our authors focus on statements, sometimes Twitter statements by Trump and others. The authors declare the slide to authoritarianism at the core of Western democracy, with or without the use of Twitter. We do not see major causes, except a few examples handed quickly in the book of fundamentally bad American manners. Democracy becomes corrupt quickly, but how? Why? This weakening of democracy, they say, sometimes is an imperceptible process, and we must be vigilant. So this piecemeal and baby steps and sometimes sudden bursts of energy, and then all of a sudden 6th January insurrections. The legacy of the left is nowhere to be seen, except tangentially in Latin America, and our authors distance themselves from it. There's no China, there's no Russia, there's no Europe, there's no Romania, except some notion of the West, Western, again, no Africa, no Asia. I'm going to skip this for the sake of time. So, hardball, and this is the language they use, it's a wonderful American idiom and Greek irony. So this is where we are today. What Trump did in the first year is not illegal, per se, they say, the authors say, but it's perhaps a little bit too rough. Again, our authors will not systematize corruption in relation to a state or capitalistic society. In fact, the word capitalism is nowhere to be seen. And populism for them, this is interesting, only emerges once. More superficially, How Democracies Die conveys that we live in a bad comedy of manners, or a grotesque pantomime, as though previous generations did politics better, with greater equanimity, better civil forbearance, and more liberal politesse. But the future is open, if dark, and the history is anecdotally superficial, as though the authors did not really believe in any Renaissance or Enlightenment, American or otherwise, anymore. How Democracies Die is superficial rendering of a few societal vignettes of traveling politics, landing in a manageable, penguin-accessible style diorama of flat universal history. There are dark clouds in the sky of the future that we must pass. How not to? And we must pass through American avatars. There's a diminution and a mitigation of these troubles which are not forcefully spelled out. And how can our authors manage to travel so superficially and effortlessly, like tourists, from one prototype to another, from one society from another, from one time space to another? So the saving of democracy at the end, the 1990s, Western liberal democracies with the US superpower at the core, this is where our authors are. America is no longer a democratic model, they say, and credit to them for saying so publicly. They advance three possible futures. One, I repeat that this book came out in the first year of Trump presidency. Trump interlude, like a bad nightmare, unlikely, they say, is a symptom of larger forces. Second, some kind of white nationalist nightmare pushed forward by the GOP, almost like a science fiction landscape of anti-immigrant deportations and restriction, voter suppression, gerrymandering, manipulation, etc. If you have seen the Cuarón's film Children of Men, I think that's quite a nice type of film for option number two. And option number three, which they say is also unlikely, they say is the most likely, is a sustainable polarization without guardrails, that's their language, institutional warfare. And they put, interestingly, because I live there, they put the state of North Carolina in the United States as an example of what their future may look like. So we're dealing with small margins of difference, we're dealing with dirty play, voter suppression and turnout, we're dealing with a 1/3 minority. So my question to them is like, why not LA, for example? It's kind of weird choice, North Carolina, for the future of America. I'm going to skip that. I'm going to bring you the big player of populism, Ernesto Laclau, okay? To my mind, the most important theorist on populism. Without question. So there you have two of his books. Ernesto Laclau, already writing in the 80s, excised from the conventional bibliography on the matter, sticking to Anglo-American conventions of liberal democracy, but the very terminology in quotation marks cannot be assumed unproblematically. Argentine Laclau settled, but you don't have to go to Southern Cone to find him, because he was settled for 4 decades in England. He lived in Essex. Yet there is nothing insular about him. Post-Marxist may be a label that you can use with him or for him. And I suppose he's drawing from a left tradition combined with philosophical schools of Western European thought, linguistics, phenomenology, structuralism, moving into post-structuralism, psychoanalysis, etc. Biographically, my moment of fame was when I got to see him live in Durham, North Carolina, in the mid-90s when I was doing my PhD. You can Google and easily find videos of his lectures, and if you are fortunate to know Spanish, then you can enjoy his first language in these freely available lectures in many places. So let me give you, obviously, a wine tasting, very fast taste of Laclau. I'm happy to send you the PowerPoint and continue the conversation. But this is, if you forget everything about what I'm saying, don't worry about it. But Google Laclau. He's the important fella on populism. So his ambitious thought passes through the history of Western continental philosophy with an emphasis on politics. Yes, Latin America is part of the West and is included here. We are dealing with a left affiliation and early experiences in Peronismo, a discourse analysis transitioning from structuralism to post-structuralism, a deconstructionist and Lacanian psychoanalytic bent engaging with political reason. What does that mean? That we're moving into the post-structuralist anti-ontological or anti-identitarian domains or Western philosophical thinking dealing with political antagonism as we contemplate the phenomenon of populism encompassing most of the 20th century and reaching us today in the early decades of the 21st century in Europe and the Americas. Peronism in Argentina, periphery of the West, if you like, is one key element neglected by all three previous Anglo representatives. Laclau is a much wider and much more theoretical and daring and biting perspective than anything proposed by Müller and Levitsky-Ziblatt. And why would you want to go there? Well, to see more and know more actors and perhaps enrich and even change your frames, expectations and conventions away from all narrow time spaces. I'm simply going, I repeat, this is a super fast, let me just give you one more, in this PowerPoint, I'm just looking at two of his lectures, and I'm going to give you a super, absolutely grotesque, brutal soundbite. Let me just read two PowerPoints, and then, because I don't know how I'm doing with time.
About 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Let me just then read you only one, and then give you the conclusion. We must, with Laclau, have the following thing in mind. We must imagine that we are in a signification field. We are producing discourse. There's no politics without discourse, and politics is fundamentally antagonism. He's coming from linguistics, structural linguistics. So he will tell you that's a chain of equivalences. This is same as this, but also different from that, in which different social positions will be making claims towards a repressive order. So we're dealing with a horizon of difference and exclusion. There's also a totality of that signifying field with the self-contradictory mechanism of impossible object or the object that is being excluded. So therefore, the field of signification or symbolization cannot do without the notion of limit and without the notion of exclusion. There is an immeasurable totality and endless internal differentiation among signs themselves. And he will be advocating the notion of catachresis, that is the wrong name in relation to signification. He's engaging in dialogue with Derrida about processes of signification, naming, using the wrong name, and placing political demands in the eyes of a political order. He gives the example, for example, of the Polish solidarity movement, the Solidarność movement, when the shipyards assume the empty signifier, the universal hegemonic condition of demands against Jaruzelski repressive regime, bringing it down. Very quickly, I don't have time to develop all this. Is very dense, it's very rich, and it will require many evenings. When a sign acquires universality of different positions, becomes empty. Becomes, if you want to, it empties itself out of signification content and assumes a universality of demands in an antagonistic relation vis-a-vis a constituted power, that he will call it always repressive power. Populist reason, understood in this philosophical manner, is not, this may be a nice way of ending, even though I have some conclusion, but let me just say like that. Populism for Laclau is not a pejorative context, is not an aberration, is not pathology, is an exteriority that is never thought out. Is the other side of the consensual administrative reason. Populism is typically addressed as noise, obscurity, opacity, lack, disagreeable and plebeian manners, something missing. There's a default mechanism, there's another to be repudiated, and as in all the previous authors that I just mentioned. But what type of political reality is referred to as populist? Bad or unpredictable heterogeneity within itself, but also in relation to the observer or speaker who assumes the good diversity, as the examples of Levitsky and Ziblatt, who close the book saying, no, there's good diversity, we liberals, we are relativistic, and we are for diversity. So you see, that is the position that they inhabit. That has nothing to do with, for example, with the Laclau understanding of populism. Passing through the moment of postmodernity, Laclau says there is a return to the possibilities of politics. Remember that for him, politics, antagonism, and the acquisition of hegemonic within different social positions, vis-a-vis a constituted power. And a revival of populism. The revival of populism is one of the manifestations of the return of politics. And populism can assume opposing ideological variants. And he cites Italian fascism and Maoism. So populism manifests a dichotomic social space, assuming an abject below or subordinate position against those above in the hierarchy of the formal or official constitution of power and knowledge. Laclau, I'm going to close this, I'm going to go to one time super quickly, 4 sentences. Laclau's diagnosis distances himself from the cognitive position of good-bad populism. He and we can certainly have our own preferences, but not at the level of the analysis and diagnosis of the political phenomenon that is, yes, generally speaking, anti-elitist, anti-establishment, and countercultural. Super quickly, wrapping up the scene. Do I have a minute? Hello?
2 minutes.
2 minutes, lovely. So, wrapping up the scene for you to think about major issues and problems. 1, political life, but also the life of the scholarship, does not begin in the 90s. So this is my basic suggestion to you. Okay, that's why I mentioned Ortega. If we want to think about politics, let's not begin with the 80s and 90s. Let's go back at least to the beginning of the 20th century with mass society. Let's not think only 1 or 2 decades back and 1 or 2 decades forward, and by all means, let's not put the US as the be-all and end-all, the origin and the end of the political discourse. Number 2, the nation-state is one important, perhaps inevitable, arena for meaningful contestation. But my challenge, and I suppose the challenge for everyone, is whether that is the main space that we want to occupy. Of course, it's inevitable. Even in this gathering, we identify ourselves as our nationality, okay? Whether we are immigrant or not, that's a different matter. But I'm wondering if that's the only space for political contestation, whether there are spaces above or spaces below that. Third, we need to stretch the imagination of the minimal geography of knowledge production and inspiration. You see what I did today, super quickly and very awkwardly. I bring you Ortega y Gasset, and I bring you Laclau. So I'm already breaking up a more reduced window into political phenomena and looking at political antagonism within even the notion of the West, which we can as well open up and magnify. And fourth, populism is not, let's not be simplistic in some kind of watching horror film, good or bad. Populism is a versatile political phenomenon, ideologically speaking. Yes, it can be unpleasant, it exacerbates antagonism and political tension, but as a variable, it can function in many ways. And I'm going to close with the following. Perhaps populism is a symptom of increasing tension in which we all live in our different societies at this moment of history, also in which perhaps a certain hegemonic worldview, let's call it Anglo-American for lack of a better word, is mutating or transforming into something else that we do not yet what that would mean. I'm going to stop there. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fernando. Those last 4 points were I think, particularly valuable. I think Polish participants may want you to unpack your discussion of solidarity a little bit more. I was a little puzzled by it myself, I have to say. Okay, Slobodan.
Sure. Thank you. No, thank you, Christopher. So I will speak about something from the field of nationalism, but I will not speak about nationalism in Central and Southeast Europe, and you will see why I have chosen to like that topic. First of all, when nationalism studies appeared for the first time, nationalism was seen as something that belonged to the past of Europe, but which also belonged to other non-Western societies. So it wasn't seen as a Western phenomenon. It was seen as something that belonged to history. And then in the 1990s, with the wars for succession, Yugoslav succession and other wars, nationalism was seen by many Western scholars as a phenomenon of Eastern Europe, Central Europe, Southeastern Europe, and of Central Asia. And it was finally, at the beginning of the 21st century, that everyone acknowledged that nationalism is something totally universal in the world in which we live, not universal, of course. It appeared in late modernity, but universal now, globally. And current trends are such that in the early 21st century, a growing wave of nationalism has been detected not only in the countries of BRICS, not only in Brazil, Russia, India, China, but also in countries like the United States, like Britain during the Brexit referendum, or like France in terms of their immigration policy in particular. Another point that I want to make is that John A. Hall significantly observed, no single universal theory of nationalism is possible, as the historical record is diverse, so too must be our concepts. And this is very important to mention because a lot of theories have been actually designed, but hardly anyone could cover all possible cases. And the same is the problem with the definition of a nation. There is not a single definition. It will have very, very significant exceptions. And I will also go back to some early theoreticians like my predecessor. There was a famous French scholar, Ernest Renan, known by his work, The Life of Jesus, which in a way announced secularization all around Europe, equally as Nietzsche's Death of God did. And he's also famous for his lecture that he delivered at Sorbonne in 1882. And he said something very idealist and postmodernist at the same time about nation. Idealist was that he said that nation was soul, a spiritual principle, but also he said the existence of a nation, you will pardon me this metaphor, is a daily referendum. Sometimes it's translated into English as referendum, sometimes as plebiscite, but nonetheless the same. Just as the continuing existence of an individual is a perpetual affirmation of life. Actually, he said that at the moment when French nation was in the process of construction, and although we would assume that it had happened much earlier, actually it was one scholar from Romania originally, Eugen Weber, who we quoted at the conference on Apocalypse, because he was an expert in nationalism studies, but also in the history of apocalyptic beliefs. And he spent most of his career in California. And he basically showed how the French nation was constructed in the last 3 decades of the 19th century. So what Ernest Renan witnessed was a nation in making. And basically, we were not, it took some time, others became aware of this, but we always have to put this question, how far did this referendum go? How many people accepted this referendum? How many people said yes? And how many people were asked at all? Major findings of nationalism studies was, first of all, that modern nation states are not primordial entities. The big European nations were constructed through nationalism in the last decades of the 19th century, the French, the Germans, the Italians. But even in the case of those nations that existed, where there was some sort of national feeling in the 16th, 17th century, like the English or later the British, traditions were actually invented, constructed in the same period, which is the end of the 19th century. So essentially nations predated nationalism, and nations are expected to outlive nationalism. So all experts in nationalism studies expect that at a certain point there will still be nations, but there will be no nationalism as we know it today. Andrew Haywood, who is like very practically oriented author and very popular. He wrote a series of books on political ideologies, which are actually standard textbooks at all American universities and Anglophone universities. He includes nationalism and religious fundamentalism among the leading political ideologies of contemporary world, along with traditional ideologies. So there are conservatism, liberalism, socialism, anarchism, and fascism. There are three postmodernist ideologies: feminism, ecologism, and multiculturalism, plus nationalism and religious fundamentalism. So nationalism basically interacts with other ideologies, of which some are very modern, some are postmodern, and it is much more complicated than with populism, that we would perhaps think that it is something completely late modern. In the last 2 decades, it started to borrow also even from postmodernist ideologies. So it becomes increasingly complex phenomenon. Now, I would like to turn your attention, I'm going back to this question that nation is a daily referendum, because actually it was in this area that case studies were made that actually showed that even at the height of nationalism, the first wave, the second half of the 19th century, early 20th century, some ethnic and linguistic groups remained for many decades immune to nationalist appeal. So settlers in Transylvania are one example, or I'm not sure if I pronounce well, in Polish, Tutejsi, in former Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, Istrians in Istria, Slavic Macedonians in Macedonia, who actually say themselves as Christians, or Romaic Romans. These are actually, this is an identity from Byzantine Empire, which by the way existed here in Wallachia and Moldova as well, quite long, in Bulgarian or Asian Turkey. So this all led historians to question nationalism studies in one very important sense, and to add another term, which is called national indifferentism. And now suddenly we have a mushrooming of books showing that many areas were not as affected by nationalism as we would expect, because we have a tendency to see nation state as an organism which equally was effective in different areas, but actually historical evidence shows it was not. And the main author in this field, Tara Zahra from the University of Chicago, this is what she says: what we might call indifference has gone by many other names, and that's why we didn't really realize that it was there. Often derogatory in the past: regionalism, cosmopolitanism, Catholicism, socialism, localism, bilingualism, intermarriage, opportunism, immorality, backwardness, stubbornness, and false consciousness, to name a few. So this national indifferentism does not apply that there were or there are people without identities. No, not at all. It only implies that in pre-modern, but also in modern era, some other types of identities coexisted or existed with the national one. Some other forms were dominant, like religious, ethno-religious, tribal. The word is now loaded, so perhaps skin-based would be more neutral. So, concomitantly also with indifferentism, there were ambiguous and dual or multiple national identities. And this only shows you how nation is everyday referendum. So at the same time, we have one nation state in which some people are ready to die for imagination, other people do not feel any attachment, and there are at the same time people who have dual or triple identity or multiple identity at the same time. This is how complicated this all is. But now we come to our age, and in our age we speak about post-nationalism, another form of indifferentism if you look at it from nationalistic point of view. And supranational markets and globalization led to the emergence of supranationalism after World War II, which is actually why the phenomenon was not seen as Western European. And these ideas were clearly ramified in Bretton Woods and in European institutions. But it is important to mention that when Monet presented his deal on subsequent European economic community, and I only quote, "The elite French intellectual community lacked a framework and language to understand what the document represented." So Monet, Schumann, and others, they clearly had something in mind, but not necessarily public opinion was ready to neither to accept it nor to analyze it or to really go into detail. So the idea behind the project was a radical rejection of nation states with the ideal of an ever closer union, and that is what basically has caused since then, but particularly since the 1980s, an increasing clash between nationalist narratives and narratives of supranationalism. And Jean-Marie Le Pen was the first who actually realized what would be effect on an ever closer union. No, it's total political mainstream. One of such parties exist everywhere and actually are in power even in some new countries and are just about to come to power in some others. So basically post-nationalism and cosmopolitanism is a project of European elites. And now we come to the question, what is the situation today? So I will use two indicators to try to answer this question, but I go back to Hall, that there is no one theory of nationalism that is applicable everywhere. And the problem with questions is that the same questions do not mean the same within different cultures. But if we want to compare anything, we must use sets of surveys that were done with similar samples at the same time. So one such is European Values Survey, which is conducted every 10 years, it's a famous one. And these are the latest results from 2021. So people were asked, is it very important for you that you were born in your country? And some people said it is very important or important, and others said it's not important or not important at all. So this is not the only indicator. You will see that we must have combinations to have nationalism index, but let's start with this one. So you can see that the highest percentage was recorded in Bulgaria, Slovakia, Romania, Russian Federation, Lithuania, etc. But then you see a series of Western European societies that where respondents said it is not important to me, or it is not important at all that I was born in Sweden, in Germany, in Denmark, in Netherlands, in Norway, in France, in Iceland. So you see that there is a huge regional difference. Another question, which of course we should ask, because this is all about nation state and how much how much European elites have been able to go beyond that, is would you fight for your country? Something that of course seems important at this point. And you can again see very huge differences. You can see very red countries, they are least ready their citizens to fight for their countries. So it's Germany, Benelux, but actually Italy is not far from that, 20%, Spain 21%. Then you can see the societies which are a little bit higher. And in Europe, only societies above 50% are only Sweden 55% and Finland out of Western countries, and Ukraine, and this is before the war, this was done several years ago, in Turkey, and Russia with 59%. But then we have the latest data, which were made, the survey was made globally in April 2022 by WIM. And you can see a huge difference between Europe and MENA. MENA is Middle East and North Africa, where actually percentage of those who are ready to fight for their country is 67.
Recording in progress.
Sure, I'll put it down. So it's 67% as opposed to only 33% in Europe. And you can see that in Europe, there is a small majority of those, these are all European countries put together, who are not ready in comparison with those who are ready. But if you take only Western Europe, that percentage would be even much more higher. And here you see that in Netherlands, 68% said no. in Japan. You see in Germany 54 no, 22 yes. And then, of course, you see countries which are very different, like Palestinian territory, Peru, Turkey, where it's very high, Pakistan, etc. So you see that actually, first of all, Europe is different from the rest of the world. It is the only continent where majority of population of those who said anything are not in favor of fighting for their country. But then within Europe, you see Western Europe, and if you would like to call it EU core, as countries that are particularly against, whose citizens are particularly against fighting for their country, do not see it as something very important. This is very, very different, as Christopher was saying, from the spirit of 1914, when nationalism reached its climax, or even from the spirit of the 1940s. So where are Central Europe and Southeast Europe? You know, I think they're more nationalistic than Western Europe, but less nationalistic than the world. They are more populist than Europe as a whole, but less than world as a whole. And overall, they're also less democratic than Western Europe, with oases of democracy, liberal democracy in Central Europe, as Baltic states. But still, they are much more democratic than is current average. Freedom House, for instance, average for global average. And economically, they are substantially behind Western Europe. Who would be actors of post-nationalism? Who could, for instance, press further for the deconstruction of nation states? Originally, as we mentioned, when Rome Treaty was made, these were cosmopolitan elites and small groups of pacifists, nothing beyond that. But now, in addition to cosmopolitan elites, there are disconnected but numerous bubbles, small groups, of all those who live in, but also beyond nation states. So they live in because we all live in nation states, but living in nation states, they somehow, through their bubbles, lived beyond them. So, for instance, IT experts, employees of international corporations and organizations, cosmopolitan part of the academia, gamers. And American scholars noticed, even back in the 1990s, that when Americans were asked, where do you come from? They used to say, I come from Texas, I come from Austin. But then they started to speak, no, I come from IBM, I come from Nokia. Because corporate identity, for some of them, became their chief identity. Why? Because corporations organize even their free time, even their holidays, even whatever, and kindergartens and who knows what else. So there are really various trends with globalization that actually challenge the existence and predominance of nation state. But what are the chances for post-national Europe? First of all, chances for post-national continent are more higher in Europe than anywhere else, as you could see, because obviously these processes have gone much further in Europe than anywhere else. They are, however, limited by current global trends. They are endangered by war. Russian attack on Ukraine basically very much endangers the whole process. And social and cultural fragmentation, which is very high, it both supports and limits supranationalism. It supports because it further weakens nation states, but it does not strengthen supranationalism because people living in those bubbles, they're mutually disconnected groups. They don't have anything in common. They're not going to unite to make supranational state. They're going to unite only if you attack them playing games. Gamers will rebel in that case, but in no other case. Or if you, introduce special taxes for non-resident IT experts or something like that, they're going to rebel. But outside of their very small interest, they're not going to rebel. At least that was the situation up to now. And then regionalism is both post-national and national, because it is based on both indifferentism and nationalism. And you actually know that many regional movements now are immersed with nationalism. And originally it was expected that regionalism will actually debase nation state. It doesn't seem that it does so in Italy, for instance. So current trends basically suggest that there is an increasing hybridity, and it is the most likely outcome in terms of the current dispute between supranationalism and nation states in the EU. So we shouldn't expect that nation states would disappear in some, during our lifetime, let's say. But we should expect that they would simply not only compete with supranationalism, but would adapt themselves to supranationalism. On the other hand, we should expect that supranationalism will also accept that certain competences must be within the field of nation states. So this is the current trend. Of course, there are other trends which are not as, let's say, progressive, if you take this to be progressive. They actually speak in favor of the strengthening of the nation state. Of course, civilizational states would, although they are not nation states, but are based on nationalism as well, they actually would suggest something completely different. But here I was talking only about European experience and whether post-national Europe would come out or not. So I would add at this point that what we could expect is some sort of hybridity, and that basically we should also look what is happening in nation states, be it in Central Europe or Southeast Europe or wherever, within these global trends. And within that, we should be aware that all the countries, if you look Freedom House indexes, they actually, not a single one had linear and only linear progression. All of them had certain fluctuations, but overall, in spite of the fact that there was a crisis for 20 years, which Leon mentioned in his introductory speech, or even more, some people speak about the third wave of autocratization that began in the 1990s. And it certainly began in this region, in Central Europe and Southeast Europe in 2010. These global trends are unavoidable, and they will sooner or later affect all the countries of the EU, and even all countries that are not members of the EU, but are simply within EU zone. And you can see this hybridity everywhere. Of course, the most famous case of hybridity I can give you from Serbia, where Prime Minister is open lesbian and Euro-Pride, and the President said he would, actually the same day when he said that he would give another mandate to an openly lesbian Prime Minister, he announced that he would ban Euro-Pride. So this is a clear case of hybridity, because those two facts give totally different aspects. Obviously, LGBT communities at the same time accepted and not accepted. Accepted at the highest post and still not accepted as being a part of the mainstream society. And this shows how this hybridity works, and we can give, I think, multiple examples from Hungary, Poland, and other countries as well. But this does not mean that supranational elements do not work. They work actually parallelly, even within societies that are seemingly very much nationalistic. At this point, I will finish.
Thank you very much, Slobodan. So what I'm going to suggest we do, which is a model that has been pursued by many panels, is I'm going to ask each of the speakers a specific question, and then I'm going to ask all three panelists a similar question, or at least a question on a similar theme, and then we'll open it up. And we have 45 minutes or so before this session comes to an end. So could I turn to Professor Mișcoiu? In the session before this one, we discussed the Catholic Church in Poland and its relationship with the present governing party. We've also touched, of course, upon the relationship in Russia between the Orthodox Church and Vladimir Putin. In my own country, there is no political role for the church at all, even though we have a state church, the Anglican Church. It's a church which is in crisis, institutionally and also at a popular level, simply because the churches are largely empty and no one listens to a word that a bishop or even an archbishop has to say. In fact, we have one archbishop who didn't believe in God, and we have a couple of bishops who don't believe in the divinity of Christ, which rather undermines their credibility amongst the faithful. Are there any parallels or differences that you would like to highlight between the situation that you've painted of the Romanian church, or Romanian the Orthodox Church here, and its relationship with politicians, and what's happening in Poland, or what's happening in Russia, or anywhere else for that matter?
Thanks a lot. Should I answer directly?
Yes,
Because I
please,
can't
yeah.
see you, so I don't know exactly when you
You're
don't
actually
have
blind, so-
eye contact.
Yeah, okay. No, please do.
Okay, thank you for this question. Yes, it's a peculiarity of the Orthodox countries is, of course, the fact that churches are much more autonomous, and there is a diffuse affiliation that was lost in time with in relation to the Greeks, Mount Athos and Constantinople. But all in all, these churches are very independent. And one of the trademarks of these churches is that they have entertained a direct relation with the state from the very beginning. They were mingled with the state in a national nation-building process, which is emphasized every time when the discussion about the separation between the church and the state is put on the table. So if you have to compare with you said first Poland and Russia. If we start with Poland, of course, there the Catholic Church has what we may call a double command, at least the fact that it is under the Pope gave it autonomy from the state in relation with the state under the communist regime, but also it put it in sometimes in a delicate position in defending national identity and national interests too much. Of course, the biggest difference would be the moral attitude and the moral credibility of the church, which in Poland is still very high, and was considered a rampart against communism, while in Romania things are very different, and all the compromises the church made in order to survive and even to partially prosper under the communist regime are nevertheless to some extent known in society. If we compare to the opposite case, which is Russia, of course, in terms of organization and relation with the state, there are many more similarities, as in the case of the Catholic or Protestant churches even. But what differentiates the most, I would say, in the case of the Romanian churches, its larger autonomy, its capacity of influencing in a decisive way decision-making processes when while keeping this myth of popular mobilization. Priests are still seen as being electoral agents, and as I tried to demonstrate in this presentation, they were quite effective electoral agents, and in a pluralistic system, which Romania is and Russia isn't, this gives the church a wider autonomy, and it stimulates also within the church, as we saw, some dissent, which is not present in Russia. And the comment about the situation of the church in Russia after the outburst of the Ukrainian the war against Ukraine, the Orthodox Church in Russia was even much more forced than before to mobilize in favor of the Putin regime. losing in this way its any relative autonomization or descent, even if they were not very much strong even before. I don't know if I answered your question as you expected.
No, that's a very comprehensive response. Thank you very much. I'll come back to you in a moment. I'd like to turn to Fernando, United States. The Swiss writer Denis de Richemont, when he found himself for the first time in Times Square in 1941, said that it was the first time he realized he was European. And in many ways, I think the European debate, which is also a sub-theme of the Western debate, has been a conversation between Europe and the United States. And one can think of Reagan's democracy initiative, which he chose to launch at Westminster, and he spoke there in 1983. One can think of Clinton and the Third Way. One can think of Obama, who was as much a European figure as an American figure in the very early days. Has that conversation now come to an end? And the reason I ask you that question here in Romania is that although I think it has come to an end, certainly even in Britain, the special relationship has got nothing to do with that conversation, it's purely power politics. Romania and Poland are clearly tied to the United States intellectually and culturally, not just as in Britain and France might be politically. So,
I'm going to give you the following soundbite, which I like. It may work or not, in response to Christopher's question. I see, after having lived in the US for 20 years, I see the US undergoing a de-Europeanization, which is slow, it's gradual. But the US is gradually delinking from Europe, okay? Demographically, intellectually. Ukraine may be a symptom of trying to reconnect, but American society is increasingly distancing itself from Europe. Maybe not the elites that remain Eurocentric, but that discourse of the West, for example, I come from the humanities. I know that Christopher cares very much about the West as a notion and also as a part of an intellectual, cultural, literary tradition. The US had in the 80s, precisely during Reagan, the notion of the West in curricula, the notion of literature, the Western literature, that then became very, obviously the Reaganites tried to energize that, to make it very Eurocentric against the multiculturalists. That debate has died, it's no longer. Among other things, students don't read literature anymore. The notion of literature is gone, so it's not. I can give you later during cocktails anecdotes about. I've done some tricks even in the UK about what they mean, what they understand by the notion of the West, and it doesn't really ring any bells. So that debate already in the 80s very clearly connected education, department, geopolitics, Reagan, Thatcher, has mutated into other things. I think my learning in Romania, which I suspect is my first time in Romania, but I suspect that the situation will be different from Eastern Europe. And the lesson is that we're dealing with different temporalities, different focuses, different emphasis. I think a certain notion of the West now is finding a certain revival, maybe in Western Europe as well. Again, as another anecdote that I think is quite telling, the notion of West in the British press is undercapitalized. It's written in lowercase, and in some cases they hesitate and they put it in uppercase. So it's kind of odd when you think about it. I'm trying to ask journalists and people what they think of this. It's kind of quirky. So I think that debate of belonging to a Western civilization as a kind of cultural milieu that Christopher is summoning in pessimistic music, I think in the West, I think it's gone. In Western Europe, I think it's gone. In the education sector, I think it's gone. In the humanities, I think it's gone. But the situation may be different in Eastern Europe. Okay, and also talking about different temporalities for different nations. I think even the very appeal of nation or nationhood is clearly very different. I like very much what Slobodan said. That if you ask maybe some young people in the classrooms, never as a frontal question because they will avoid the conversation, but in a kind of oblique type of way, that what's your geography, what's your horizon, what's your landscape, they're going to give you game. They're going to give you. It's what they do in their free time. It's the music they consume. The notion of immediate geography and all that kind of thing doesn't really apply. So again, that is probably, we are all undergoing all those challenges of transformation.
Thank you very much. I know what you mean about literature. I was giving a lecture in Colby College some years ago, and at the end of it, a young student came up to me and said, "So what?" I'd mentioned Mark Twain in my lecture. So he said, "So what's Twain writing these days?" It reminded me of the question that was asked of Arthur Sullivan in the 1880s when he went to the United States. And someone came up to him and said, "So what's Mr. Bach composing these days?" And he said, "He's not. He's been decomposing." Let me pass to you, Slobodan. What would Vladimir Putin, had he been in the audience today, make of your analysis? Would confirm him this hybridity, the decadence, which is one of his favourite words, of Europe? Adrian used the word political decay because, of course, no Westerner will ever use the term decadence. That's also fallen completely out of fashion. It's not an acceptable word, I think, in many circles now. Decay, of course, is acceptable. But would he see hybridity in what you're talking about, the future of Europe, as confirmation of its decadence?
Well, I think he would consider the whole conference a nonsense, but speaking of my presentation in particular, maybe he would be encouraged seeing some of the data, but not all, because, of course, he's engaged even more with a particular nation state in which actually people still believe that they should defend their country. If he plans to go further, this is relevant. But of course, these data are known for years. Everyone knows he knew that. And I think that one of the reasons why he started the whole war is that he actually assessed that consumerist society would prevail in the West, and that by the end of this autumn, people will start to speak about electricity bills and other things, and not about political issues. And I think that that has been a part of his whole plan. So certainly he sees Western Europe as decadent. But actually, I think that what he could have found out, what he found out to his huge surprise, is that Russia is much more a consumer society than he expected, and that Russia is much more corrupted vertically than he anticipated, and that actually the whole units which he believed existed did not exist, whole depots that were supposed to be full were not full, etc. So I don't know how he's reading all of that, but by the fact how many people he dismissed, it appears that he realized that his original assumptions were wrong.
Thank you very much. Now, can I ask all three speakers, they can answer it as they wish. It's about ideas, because that's what we're talking about here. First of all, Professor Mișcoiu, is there any new theology in Romania? In Western Europe, theology is important. Christianity without Christ, religion without God. These are talked about at great length. People like Vatimov, for example, is a good Catholic but doesn't believe in the divinity of Christ. He wrote a book some years ago defending religious belief and religious faith. It's not a book that would have appealed to the Pope, but he considers himself a good Catholic. There is a new theology in Western Europe, especially within the Protestant churches, but also, I think, to some extent within Catholicism. Is there any theological discussion taking religion into the second half of the first half of the 21st century? Or are the priests that you talked about the kind of priests whose beliefs would have been standard beliefs back in the 1950s?
Yeah, thank you. Very good question. Of course, there are debates within the Orthodox Church, and I'm not myself very specialist in theology. There are debates about renewing the church, but also renewing more substantively, ontologically, the faith. And apart from, let's say, the liberal priests who are fashionable using social media and everything that could seem as being modern. We've got also some of them, more specifically, who are on a much more liberal platform, who would try to change the mindset and, of course, reform the church. But there is also, and that's a part that our research reveals, a counter-reaction that is very strong, and it's even stronger than any attempt of reform within the church, which is reactionary, which is oriented towards bringing back the church to the core values, and these core values are, and this is quite disturbing in terms of perspective, closer to a radical vision of the nation, of the relation between man and woman, the inferiority of women, and many other such ideas that come from, of course, the beginnings of the morality proposed and proffered by the Orthodox Church. So, to put things in a nutshell, I think that the debates, the more philosophical, theological debates within the church concern quite narrow layer of those who are really scholars within the theological movements, and some of them are very present in the church, but they have less influence over the real people of the church, so to call the basic priests at the countryside, who are reacting based rather on frustration, based on inputs that come from various sources, and internalized in a much more ritualistic way those inputs, transferring them into society. To put it in in other words, these very subtle philosophical, theological debates were never present in their minds, and what was present was only the need of the church to prosper and to defend itself against the potential threats. And this is a discourse that gains in intensity, especially in the rural areas, but also in other more small urban areas, with no input from higher, much more academic or scholar debate that could influence the doctrine of the church itself.
Thank you very much. Fernando, Ortega y Gasset's book went into 26 editions. Everyone read it. It's in various languages. Saul Beller's short story back in the 60s called Mosby's Memoirs, in which the young Mosby is a guy who was brought up on revolt of the masses and then progresses to other works. Who are the intellectuals today? Are there any intellectuals associated with European populism or nationalism? I think of the great book, The Treason of the Intellectuals, which was how ideas have betrayed Europe in the early 20th century. I can't see who the intellectuals are who are supporting the public intellectuals I'm talking about, and where Ortega became a public intellectual, whether by design or by default, who the public intellectuals are, who are rallying to the forces, or rallying the forces of populism or nationalism.
Right, I'm trying to think, let's say, for example, you put me on the spot, but if I were to say the Podemos movement in Spain, that is coming out of University of Madrid mostly, also Barcelona sectors, they were very young university professors, some of them newly tenured. So now, am I going to call them intellectual, big time intellectual? Probably not. But they were having a dialogue with different people in Latin America, also with Laclau having a dialogue, even with Chantal Mouffe. So those people are bubbling with something that is in the air. Now, very quickly, some of those populists, let's say, because there was strong discontent in the streets, there were massive protests, typically anti-corruption, they get assimilated very quickly. So now that they're being neutralized. So some of those individuals will be consuming, and they would try to have dialogues with, I wouldn't call them intellectuals, but at least trying to find a voice in the media, in newspapers, the radio, probably increasingly digital cultures, right? I can't really see. I hesitate to call, for example, Henri Levy, the type of public intellectual in a very French style, for example, who is very, actually, interestingly, if you're curious about what I'm going to say, there's a debate that you can find, if you Google Henri Levy debate with Dugan, it took place in Amsterdam probably 5 or 10 years ago. So there you see two public intellectuals, let's say, debating actually some of the ideas that we're talking about now, the West, a certain notion of liberal West. So Henri Levy is more liberal interventionist, and Dugan is interestingly talking about the notions of Russian culture invoking Foucault and more anti-universalist. So it's a very interesting debate. They're both speaking in English in a kind of dubious accents, which adds a local flavor to the debate. But that type of, I don't know who in you, obviously there's the German intellectual, the great, still the communication theory, Habermas, that type of intellectual, I think is dying, or is not there. Britain, I don't see.
You never had it.
He never. But correct me if I'm wrong. Britain is interesting because even as an anecdote, I do consume a lot of foreign affairs, and I move through think tanks, and I say, but who's thinking about international ideas? Who's thinking about Europe? No, they're not interested in that, and they give the floor to liberal internationalists, to the Americans, which is like, okay, I understand, is the superpower, bring me a representative, but don't you have something to say? You just want them to tell us what's going on in the world. So I don't see that. So I agree with you. I don't really see a strong voice, and perhaps we already live in the kind of post-public intellectual moment. Perhaps, I don't know.
Yes. Nietzsche, who said that there are no people of ideas. The English, they get them all from the newspapers they read at breakfast in the morning. He was against reading newspapers at breakfast. He was against newspapers. Ideas. Who should we be reading?
Okay, well, first of all, I think there are some public intellectuals. For instance, Timothy Snyder in America, who wrote Tyrannies. Not too many, but still there are some. Who should we be reading? I think that we should be, I agree, this is why I started with Renan. I agree that things do not start in the 1980s or 1990s. Actually, I see at my department that unless something was published in the last 5 years, it is considered to be outdated. So if you submit your article and if everything is not, if all footnotes are from the last 5 years, it means that you're not a serious scholar anymore. So it looks like IT, where information are really outdated in 5 or 10 years. But I think here actually knowledge is cumulative and we should go back. So who should be? I of course would opt for reading Freud again and Civilization Discontent is my favorite author. But I would also suggest that we should read much more European literature. And speaking of the United States, you yourself in your book exposed this fact that civilization courses were abandoned in the United States, and that was one of. And of course, they could have been redesigned. It's okay that they are not Eurocentric, it goes without saying. So they should have been redesigned to include civilization of the world, like the UN does. But civilization courses should be there, because unless we take main works from history of civilization, intellectual history of civilization, including Mahabharata and everything else, Sun Tzu, for your field. What is there? Because outside of the scope of intellectual history, humanity does not have too much to rely on. We now even challenge the fact whether Neolithic civilization and introduction of agriculture, which was the beginning of civilization, was a positive or a negative act. So we go back to Gibbon that history is perhaps not much more than the list of various wars and destructions and other misfortunes of humanity, but where history really reveals itself as some sort of grandeur, it's intellectual history. And I'm afraid that this has been very much put aside in the West. And this is why I said at the previous conference that we're very thankful to the Red Seal Foundation for organizing events like this, where you can still debate intellectual history and intellectual authors. So what Timothy Snyder said in this book on tyranny, which I just quoted, is that if you don't know American history, how are you going to defend American democracy? So I would really suggest going back to some great historians, writers, etc., from European intellectual history. I wouldn't give names because I may be accused of Eurocentrism and Anglocentrism. It certainly would be my case, but of course, from this wider perspective, Ortega y Gasset would be one of the authors who I certainly would suggest Unamuno as well, etc.
Thank you very much. Well, let me open it up to the floor and also encourage our speakers, if they would like to engage each other in debate, ask questions of each other or challenge each other's point of view, please feel free to do that as well. But let's open it up and we'll start with that. Yes.
Okay, Andrzej Sadecki from Center for Eastern Studies in Warsaw. I have the question to Sergiu Mișcoiu. I'm not sure if I'm heard.
Yes.
There.
Can you hear the question?
I can't really hear him. It's a very bad sound. Sorry.
And speak a little louder. Or directly into the microphone.
Okay, so I have a question about the role of Romanian Church. It seems to me that Romania is a country which is very much pro-Western, both in the foreign policy, but also in the sort of attitudes of the population towards the EU, NATO, willingness of Russia. But here you are presenting the church and the our party as this sort of anti-Western actor. And my question would be how, whether they are also engaging with this sort of general orientation of Romania, or they somehow reconcile that, this sort of anti-Western and pro-Western sentiments. And the second question, I don't have to be close to the microphone anymore, to Slobodan Markovich about nationalism. It seems that nationalism was, of course, compromised after the first part of the 20th century with all the horrors that it's kind of legitimized. And but now with the war and with the sort of revival of Ukrainian nationalism, we see the sort of anti-imperial nationalism again, this kind of liberal nationalism reminding the sort of mid-19th century Spring of Nations nationalist revolutions. And do you see this kind of change in the way nationalism would be seen nowadays, or this kind of, maybe nationalism is coming back with a different brand? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So, Professor Mișcoiu, if you could answer first, please.
Thank you for this question, which is very pertinent. I would say that this is quite a paradox, and several scholars try to investigate this paradox in that we had, in the second half of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s, a party which was anti-Semitic, ultra-nationalist, anti-Gypsy, and so on. The Greater Romania Party, which climbed to 22% in the 2000 parliamentary elections, and its leader to 29% in those elections. But the same party declared itself favorable to the accession of Romania to the European Union. So this shows that there is a double standard and quite hypocritical attitude in that the European Union is seen as being a provider of financial support and space for economic development. NATO is seen by most Romanians as a protector against the dangers coming from outside, but this doesn't mean that strong values of liberal democracy are entrenched in those people, and this doesn't mean that those international organizations are perceived as being necessarily promoters of such values. And of course, for the priests who supported our, this problem became salient. So this hypocrisy was no longer bearable in that on several occasions they had to confront what they believed in, what their interests and the attitudes of the West. And that's why they turned against the church, but against the European Union. But once again, even those priests were quite favorable to the economic and social advantages of belonging to the European Union and to the protective attitude of NATO in case of a war. So this means that we are in a case which is quite unique, as far as I know, of a huge hiatus between the cultural and ideological, social and ideological values on one hand, and the economic and security values on the other hand, with the Romanians being not at all provoked, challenged by the fact that these institutions, these sets of entities defend a common kind of ideal, which is opposed to either one or the other of the two sets of values. And I'm pretty sure that we need to investigate even more, not only on a sociological basis, but also on a more philosophical dimension, why this happens in the case of Romania.
Thank you. Slobodan.
Well, yes, this is a very interesting question about liberal nationalism. I think that nationalism was debased to such a level in Western societies that no one could ever accept the possibility of liberal nationalism anymore in Western relevant intellectual circles. But I think, yes, that the idea will be present in Central Europe, Southeast Europe, in Israel. Such ideas you can hear. There are books being published with the titles Merits of Nationalism and similar. I think that even if you look at how deep our differences, it is enough to look at right-wing parties. And although, of course, Polish party is also very hybrid and flirts with socialism in many aspects when it is useful. Right-wing parties, many right-wing parties actually accept rather huge part of the repertoire of human rights in the West. And famously in Netherlands, we had one of the leaders of their far-right movement was gay, and that was considered as totally normal in the Netherlands, which would of course automatically eliminate such a person in Central or Southeast Europe as a leader. And also, even Costa recently published an analysis that there are two types of voters in today's Europe. There are voters for peace and voters for justice. And while, for instance, in Poland or in Baltic states, voters for justice prevail and they want justice about Russian destruction of Ukraine, there are also voters for peace who simply want peace, like in Italy and elsewhere. And with all possible compromises that peace could bring, and which cannot be anticipated. So basically there is a division, but I think that no one should undermine the history of pacifism. And although, for instance, Britain is famous for I don't know how many wars Christopher can say, it is also one of global centers of pacifism traditionally. And although Britain has deprived workers of many of their rights, it is, after all, the country which started the whole thing with workers' rights. So, also here, so I don't know, I don't think that liberal nationalism will be accepted, and I don't even think that for many far-right parties it is their central point anymore. I think that those parties have become so hybrid that in the last elections in France, imagine that you were an alien who read classical philosophical texts. What would you conclude after hearing the last debate between French president and Le Pen, and the main candidate, Le Pen, who was liberal, who was from the left, who was from the right? It would be very difficult really to say if you didn't have context, if you just listen to it. And that shows you how far hybridity has gone. And of course, Le Pen's party is the most obvious case of it. And they appeal to regionalism, they appeal even to class consciousness, they appeal to all possible things that could bring votes. So we should more look those political parties in terms of populism without necessarily overloads which are negative or positive, than in terms of nationalism, because they actually went beyond that. Although, of course, xenophobia is always useful if you have immigration and xenophobia can be exploited.
Before I ask Fernando to also comment, can I just mention, since you mentioned Britain, that one of the best-selling books a few years ago, Christmas stocking filler for young children, was called All the Countries We've Invaded. In fact, we've invaded, occupied, or passed through without invitation all but 13 of the 193 members of the United Nations. So I think you can say that my country is the most dangerous historically, as far as the written record is concerned. But of course, now it's very different. And as Emile Cioran has said about us in the 1960s, we've become nice and therefore historically irrelevant. You might think that since Brexit, we're no longer quite as nice as we were in the 1960s.
I have two quick. Obviously, this could go in many directions, but let me say what I have written. I like Slobodan's presentation a lot, but I'm going to add one dimension. There's also obviously supranational, the national nation state level, but also the below the nation, namely the regional level. And perhaps populism is operating at the level of regional, impoverished regions left behind that cannot have access to higher levels. When I drive with my wife through the Midlands, I tell her sometimes, take me to this place or that place. And she goes, no, that's very impoverished, that's very sad. And you're going to be blasting England. You know, no, I want to see it. Some of those environments in the Midlands are not coming back. You see impoverished Britain very regionalized and with Brexit vote. So I'm simply I'm trying to present a diagnosis of what I witnessed, almost like with a documentarian eye. Populism may come from those environments, right? So trying to analyze why they respond the way they respond, I think to me is what I was trying to articulate. Since Unamuno has been mentioned, Unamuno has a very interesting history, a concept called intra-history, namely as a but some provincial Spaniard with good writer who opposed the fascists in Salamanca, which is where my family comes from. He developed the notion of intrahistory. What is intrahistory? Intrahistory is, I don't look at big history, geopolitics, because I come from a provincial nation. My nation state is problematic and it can go in many directions. He was as a Basque, he was a centralist, and he was a classicist. Okay, so a very interesting combo right there. But he developed the notion of intrahistory. Intrahistory is, it's almost like intimate history, but it's like my whereabouts, my daily life, my family history, what I drink, what I eat, what I listen to. That notion of intrahistory could be significant in some of the aspects that I'm talking about. I'm going to just provoke, not Christopher, but in the sense that Britain does have a church. The Church of England is actually quite peculiar because the Queen is the head of the church. But I'm going to invite you to think about the following. But I invite you to think about the following: is establishment. It doesn't need a strong, potent discourse. So perhaps establishment in some environments doesn't need to invoke big, powerful symbols, and is simply making sure that there's no strong competitor in its midst. Being raised I'm not religious, but being raised as a Catholic, I always go sometimes to different churches. I went to the one across the street, and I really enjoy the pomp, the ceremony, and I enjoy that. I like theatre, I like opera, I like music, I like language. And I always, again, I find always Church of England ritual really missing, really faulty. I find the symbology quite thin. But giving it a different spin, it doesn't have to be strong. It doesn't have to be potent. You don't need lots of images of saints and Virgin Mary and all that. It's enough that the space is not populated by other imagery. And it's clearly within the spheres of Christianity. And the final point I'm going to make is perhaps the debilitation of nationalism that Slobodan has detected in Western Europe, which I think it has to do with we're dealing with consumer societies. So in consumer societies, mostly what you want is hedonistic, in more advanced consumer societies. What you want is a hedonistic individual consumer. And that type of individual is not going to be clearly going for sacrifice. And is not going to want to be engaged with agonies of tension at any level. Now, those subjects now undergoing austerity, undergoing the debilitation of the welfare state, they may radicalize politically, may antagonize politically, and may go populist. I remember, according to Laclau, I apologize to Laclau because I did a very poor rendering of him, but that enhanced antagonism in consumer societies undergoing populism and undergoing austerity may enhance the social antagonism, hence the populism, the tension, the social tension. And where is that going to go ideologically is something that I suppose we need to pay close attention to. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We shouldn't talk about the agonies of the Church of England here, because it will be disestablished as soon as the Queen passes away, because Prince Charles has made clear that he has no problem with that whatsoever. And in fact, the title Defender of the Faith, which was awarded to Henry VIII by the Pope, and which Henry VIII kept after leaving the Church of Rome, will be called Defender of the Faiths. Defender of the Faiths. So it will no longer be a national church or one associated perhaps with a particular community. We have run out of time. We need to, with Pamela sitting in the back, kitchens, etc. It's very important we start on time. I am going to ask whether Nikolai would like to say a few words at the closure of this conference. And since I happen to have the microphone, could I, as Director of LSE Ideas, thank everyone who put this together. Pamela, of course, is our host. Obviously, Leon, for his energies, for everyone who's helped, particularly with the PowerPoint presentations, most recently to Nikolai, of course, and above all to all of you for coming, asking questions and making it all possible. Can I just ask for a round of applause, however, for our three speakers?
I'll just be very fast to say thank you all for coming to our events over these last days. Congratulations to those who did the last leg today, which is the last leg in the relay race is the one that gets all the glory. So think about that. It's been a fascinating few days, and thank you everybody who's come from far away, particularly the Polish contingent. Great to have you all here, and hope we'll see you again in other places in Poland, Iceland, London, Turda. And one last little announcement is that, and please tell any of your colleagues who are not in the room but here in Turda, is that tomorrow morning, at Christopher's request, because he's a great enthusiast, Christopher will be leading a group to the old beer factory, which is like a 10-minute walk down the road at 10 o'clock. The old beer factory has 2 exhibits in it, which are very well worth seeing. One is it's the they call them the Factory Museum of Optical Illusions, and so if you want to go and see a bit of magic, but of course explained by science, because we don't believe in ghosts here anymore, do we? After our earlier sessions, it's plus it's a work in progress, but it's still very much worth seeing. Model railway setup that he has there in an enormous room. The room is about as big as this whole room, and it's model railway trains and forests and mountains and cable cars and quarries and everything. So 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, and the museum will be open. It's you spend about 45 minutes, an hour there, whatever, or as long as you like, and then come back here. Thank you.